Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly, and to Josephus. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and this is Part 8, the opening of Book 2 of the Wars of the Jews. When we left off, old Herod the Great lay dead, his kingdom soaked in the blood of his own family. Now his son Archelaus makes a great funeral feast and reaches for the crown, but a Jerusalem crowd presses him about the men Herod burned, and at the Passover the soldiers turn on the multitude and thousands die in the temple courts. While Archelaus sails to Rome to plead for the kingdom, the whole land catches fire. The Roman officer Sabinus plunders the temple treasury, the people rise, and Varus the governor of Syria marches down with his legions to crush the revolt. Let us begin.
The need for Archelaus to travel to Rome became the cause of new disturbances. After he had mourned his father for 7 days, he gave the people a very costly funeral feast. This custom had ruined many Jews, because they were expected to feed the multitude, and anyone who failed to do so was not regarded as a holy person. Then Archelaus put on a white garment and went up to the temple, where the people greeted him with many different acclamations. From a raised seat and a golden throne he spoke kindly to the crowd. He thanked them for the zeal they had shown at his father's funeral, and for the submission they had already offered to him, as though he were already established in the kingdom. At the same time, he said that he would not yet take on either the authority of a king or any of the titles that belonged to it until Caesar, whom the Testament had made master of the whole matter, confirmed the succession. He reminded them that when the soldiers at Jericho wanted to place the diadem on his head, he had refused to accept it. But when the Romans, the higher lords in the matter, had given him a complete title to the kingdom, he would repay both the soldiers and the people abundantly for their eagerness and goodwill toward him. He added that he would make it his care to appear in every respect better than his father. The people were pleased with this, and at once tested his intentions by asking large favors from him. Some cried out that he should lighten their taxes. Others asked him to remove the duties on merchandise. Others asked him to release those who were in prison. In all these matters he answered readily in a way that satisfied them, because he wanted to win the goodwill of the multitude. After that he offered the proper sacrifices and feasted with his friends. But toward evening a great many of those who wanted change gathered in crowds. Now that the public mourning for the king was over, they began mourning for their own cause. They lamented the men whom Herod had put to death because they had cut down the golden eagle that had stood over the gate of the temple. This was not a private mourning. The lamentation was great, the ceremony of grief was solemn, and the weeping was so loud that it was heard throughout the city, because they mourned men who, they said, had died for the laws of their country and for the temple. They cried out that those whom Herod had honored ought to be punished for these deaths. First of all, they said, the man whom Herod had made high priest should be removed, and someone more pious and pure should be chosen in his place. Archelaus was angered by these outcries, but because he was in haste to go to Rome, he held back from taking revenge on the leaders. He feared that if he made war on the multitude, such an action might keep him at home. So he tried to calm the innovators by persuasion rather than force. He privately sent his general to them, and through him urged them to be quiet. But the seditious men threw stones at the general and drove him away as soon as he came into the temple, before he could say anything to them. They treated others in the same way after him, though many were sent by Archelaus to bring them back to moderation. On every occasion they answered with passion, and it was plain that if only their numbers became large enough, they would not remain quiet. The feast of unleavened bread was now near, the feast which the Jews call the Passover, and which is usually celebrated with a great number of sacrifices. An innumerable multitude came from the country to worship. Some of these stood in the temple mourning the rabbins who had been put to death, and supported their sedition by begging for their food. Archelaus became frightened by this, and before the disease could spread through the whole multitude, secretly sent a tribune with his cohort of soldiers against them. He ordered the soldiers to force those who had begun the tumult to be quiet. The whole multitude was enraged at them, threw stones at many of the soldiers, and killed them. The tribune himself fled away wounded, and escaped only with great difficulty. After this the people returned to their sacrifices, as though they had done nothing wrong. Archelaus now saw that the multitude could not be restrained without bloodshed, so he sent his whole army against them. The infantry came in great numbers through the city, and the cavalry came by way of the plain. They fell suddenly upon the people while they were offering their sacrifices and destroyed about 3,000 of them. The rest of the multitude scattered into the neighboring mountains. Archelaus's heralds followed them and commanded everyone to go back to his own home. They all did so, and the festival was abandoned. Archelaus then went down to the seaside with his mother and his friends Publius, Ptolemy, and Nicolaus. He left Philip behind as steward in the palace, to take care of his household affairs. Salome also went with him, along with her sons, and so did the king's brothers and sons-in-law. In appearance they went to give him all the help they could in securing the succession. In reality they went to accuse him of breaking the laws by what he had done at the temple. When they reached Caesarea, Sabinus, the procurator of Syria, met them. He was on his way up to Judea to secure Herod's property, but Varus, the president of Syria, who had come there, held him back from going farther. Archelaus had sent for Varus at the earnest request of Ptolemy. For the time being, out of regard for Varus, Sabinus neither went to the citadels, nor shut up the treasuries where Herod's money had been laid. He promised to remain quiet until Caesar had examined the affair. So he stayed at Caesarea. But as soon as those who restrained him were gone, when Varus had gone to Antioch and Archelaus had sailed to Rome, Sabinus immediately went on to Jerusalem and seized the palace. He summoned the governors of the citadels and the stewards of the king's private affairs, tried to search out the accounts of the money, and attempted to take possession of the citadels. But the governors of those citadels remembered the commands Archelaus had given them. They continued to guard them, and said that the custody of the citadels belonged to Caesar rather than to Archelaus. Meanwhile, Antipas also went to Rome to contend for the kingdom. He insisted that the earlier testament, in which he had been named king, was valid rather than the later one. Salome had promised to assist him, as had many of Archelaus's relatives, even though they had sailed along with Archelaus himself. Antipas also brought with him his mother and Ptolemy, the brother of Nicolaus, who seemed to be a person of great weight because Herod had placed great trust in him, and had counted him among his most honored friends. Yet Antipas depended chiefly on Irenaeus the orator. On Irenaeus's authority he had rejected those who advised him to yield to Archelaus, because Archelaus was the elder brother, and because the Second Testament had given him the kingdom. When they arrived in Rome, the inclinations of all Archelaus's relatives, who hated him, turned toward Antipas. Still, what they almost desired at first was to live under their own laws, without a king, and to be placed under a Roman governor. If they failed in that aim, then they wanted Antipas to be their king. Sabinus also assisted them in the same purpose through letters that he sent, in which he accused Archelaus before Caesar and highly commended Antipas. Salome and those with her arranged the charges they brought against Archelaus and put them into Caesar's hands. Through this Archelaus wrote out the reasons for his own claim, and through Ptolemy sent in his father's ring and his father's accounts. Caesar then carefully weighed, by himself, what both sides had to say. He considered the great burden of the kingdom, the largeness of its revenues, the number of children Herod had left behind, and the letters he had received from Varus and Sabinus about the matter. Then he assembled the leading men among the Romans. In that assembly Caius, the son of Agrippa and Julius, whom Caesar had adopted as his own son, sat in the first seat. Caesar gave the pleaders permission to speak. Then Antipater, the son of Salome and the sharpest pleader among all Archelaus's opponents, stood up and accused him. He said that Archelaus was only contending for the kingdom in words, while in deeds he had long been exercising royal authority. By asking now to be heard about the succession, he was only insulting Caesar, since he had not waited for Caesar's decision. Antipater charged that after Herod's death Archelaus had bribed certain people to call for the diadem to be placed on his head, that he had seated himself on the throne and answered petitions like a king, that he had changed the arrangements of the army and raised some men to higher dignities, that he had granted the people everything they asked of him as though he were already their king, and that he had released people whom his father had imprisoned for the gravest reasons. After all this, Antipater said, Archelaus now wanted only the shadow of the royal authority whose substance he had already seized for himself, making Caesar lord not over real matters but only over words. He reproached Archelaus further by saying that his mourning for his father had been a pretense. By day he wore a sorrowful face, but by night he drank to great excess. Antipater claimed that the recent disturbance among the multitude had come from their indignation at this behavior. The main force of his whole speech was to magnify Archelaus's crime in killing such a multitude around the temple, people who had come to the festival, yet were barbarously slain in the midst of their own sacrifices. He said that such a heap of dead bodies had been piled up in the temple as even a foreign war, suddenly breaking out before it had been formally declared, could not have produced. He added that Herod had foreseen this barbarity in Archelaus, and for that reason had never given him any hope of the kingdom, until Herod's mind had become weaker than his body. At that time, Antipater said, Herod could no longer reason soundly, and did not truly know the character of the son whom he made his successor in the Second Testament. This was done when Herod had no complaint against the one he had named earlier, at a time when his body was sound and his mind free from passion. Yet even if someone supposed that Herod's judgment while sick was better than at another time, Archelaus had still forfeited the kingdom by his own behavior and by actions contrary and harmful to the law. For what kind of king would this man be, Antipater asked, once he received the government from Caesar, if he had already killed so many before receiving it? Antipater spoke at length in this manner, produced many of Archelaus's relatives as witnesses to prove every part of the accusation, and then ended his speech. After him Nicolaus stood up to plead for Archelaus. He argued that the slaughter in the temple could not have been avoided, and that those who had been killed had become enemies not only to the kingdom of Archelaus, but also to Caesar, who was to decide the matter concerning him. He also showed that Archelaus's accusers had themselves advised him to do other things for which they could later have accused him. But above all, Nicolaus insisted that the later testament ought to be regarded as valid because in it Herod had appointed Caesar as the person who should confirm the succession. A man who showed such prudence, Nicolaus argued, by stepping back from his own power and yielding it to the Lord of the world, could not be supposed to have been mistaken in his judgment about the person who was to inherit from him. And a man who knew so well whom to choose as arbiter of the succession could not have been ignorant of the person he chose as successor. When Nicolaus had finished all he had to say, Archelaus came forward and silently fell down before Caesar's knees. Caesar raised him up in a very gracious manner, and declared that Archelaus was indeed worthy to succeed his father. Even so, Caesar made no firm decision in the case. After dismissing the assessors who had been with him that day, he deliberated privately about the arguments he had heard. He considered whether it was proper to appoint one of those named in the testaments as Herod's successor, or whether the government should be divided among all Herod's descendants, because so many of them seemed to need support from it. Before Caesar had made any decision about these affairs, Malthus, the mother of Archelaus, became sick and died. Letters also came from Syria from Varus, reporting a revolt of the Jews. Varus had foreseen this. After Archelaus sailed away, Varus had gone up to Jerusalem to restrain those who were promoting sedition, because it was clear that the nation would not remain quiet. He left in the city one of the legions he had brought with him from Syria, and then returned himself to Antioch. But after Varus was gone, Sabinus came and gave the Jews an opportunity for new disturbances. He tried to force the keepers of the citadels to hand them over to him, and he made a harsh search for the king's money. He relied not only on the soldiers Varus had left behind, but also on the large number of his own servants, whom he armed and used as instruments of his greed. When the feast observed after 7 weeks was near, the feast the Jews call Pentecost, whose name comes from the number of days after the Passover, the people gathered together. But they did not gather for the customary worship of God. They gathered because of their anger at the present state of affairs. An immense multitude came running together from Galilee, Idumea, Jericho, and Perea beyond Jordan. Those who naturally belonged to Judea itself surpassed the rest both in number and in eagerness. They divided themselves into 3 groups and pitched their camps in 3 places. One was on the north side of the temple, another on the south side by the hippodrome, and the third at the palace on the west. In this way they lay all around the Romans on every side, and besieged them. Sabinus was frightened by both their number and their courage. He continually sent messengers to Varus and begged him to come quickly to his aid, saying that if Varus delayed, his legion would be cut to pieces. Sabinus himself climbed to the highest tower of the fortress, which was called Phasaelus after Herod's brother, who had been destroyed by the Parthians. From there he made signals to the soldiers of the legion to attack the enemy, for his fear was so great that he did not dare go down to his own men. The soldiers were persuaded, rushed out into the temple, and fought a terrible battle with the Jews. As long as no one was above them to trouble them, the Romans prevailed because of their military skill, and because the Jews lacked such training. But once many of the Jews had climbed to the tops of the cloisters and began throwing their darts downward onto the heads of the Romans, many Romans were killed. It was not easy for the Romans to take revenge on those who were throwing weapons from above, and it was no easier for them to hold out against those who came to fight them hand to hand. Because the Romans were badly pressed in both ways, they set fire to the cloisters, which were admirable works because of both their size and their costliness. Those who were on top of them were quickly surrounded by the flames, and many died there. Many others were killed by the enemy, who suddenly came upon them. Some threw themselves backward down from the walls. Others, seeing how desperate their situation was, killed themselves with their own swords before the fire could reach them. Those who crept down from the walls and came against the Romans were easily overcome, because they were stunned by what had happened. At last, after some of the Jews had been destroyed and others had been scattered by terror, the soldiers fell upon the treasure of God, which had now been left deserted, and plundered about 400 talents. Sabinus gathered for himself whatever part of this sum had not been carried away by the soldiers. Yet this destruction of the works around the temple and of the men caused a much larger number, and men of a more warlike kind, to gather together against the Romans. They surrounded the palace and threatened to destroy everyone inside unless they quickly went away. They promised that Sabinus would suffer no harm if he went out with his legion. Many of the king's party deserted the Romans and helped the Jews. But the most warlike body of all the king's party, 3,000 men of Sebast, went over to the Romans. Their captains Rufus and Gratus did the same. Gratus commanded the infantry of the king's party, and Rufus commanded the cavalry. Even apart from the troops under them, each man carried great weight in war because of his strength and wisdom. The Jews continued the siege and tried to break down the walls of the fortress. They cried out to Sabinus and his party to go away, and not stand in their way now that, after a long time, they hoped to recover the ancient liberty their forefathers had enjoyed. Sabinus was quite willing to escape the danger he was in, but he distrusted the assurances the Jews gave him. He suspected that their mild offer was only bait laid as a trap. This suspicion, together with his hope of help from Varus, made him endure the siege longer. At the same time there were great disturbances in many parts of the country. The opportunity now offered led many men to set themselves up as kings. In Idumea, 2,000 of Herod's veteran soldiers gathered together, armed themselves, and fought against the king's party. Archelaus, the king's first cousin, fought against them from some of the strongest fortified places, while avoiding a direct battle with them in the plains. In Sepphoris, a city of Galilee, there was also Judas, the son of that chief robber Hezekias, who had formerly overrun the country and had been subdued by King Herod. Judas gathered no small multitude, broke open the place where the royal armor was stored, armed the men around him, and attacked those who were eager to gain the dominion. In Perea, Simon, one of the king's servants, trusted in the handsome appearance and tallness of his body, and also placed a diadem on his own head. He went about with a band of robbers he had gathered together, burned down the royal palace at Jericho, and also burned many other costly buildings. He easily obtained spoils by robbery, as though snatching them out of the fire. He would soon have burned down all the fine buildings if Gratus, the captain of the infantry of the king's party, had not taken the Trachonite archers and the most warlike men of Sebaste and gone out to meet him. Simon's foot soldiers were killed in great numbers in the battle. Gratus also cut Simon himself to pieces as he was fleeing through a narrow valley. While Simon was running away, Gratus struck him obliquely on the neck and broke it. The royal palaces near Jordan at Betharantha were also burned down by some other seditious men who came from Perea. At this time a certain shepherd named Athrongeus dared to set himself up as king. His bodily strength made him expect such dignity, and so did his spirit, which despised death. Besides these qualities he had 4 brothers like himself. He placed a troop of armed men under each of his brothers, and used them as generals and commanders when he made his raids, while he himself acted like a king and dealt only with the more important matters. At this time he put a diadem around his head, and afterward he and his brothers continued for a considerable time to overrun the country. He became their leader in killing both Romans and men of the king's party. No Jew escaped him either, if any profit could be gained from killing him. Once he even dared to surround an entire troop of Romans at Emmaus, while they were carrying grain and weapons to their legion. His men shot arrows and darts at them, and killed their centurion Arius and 40 of the bravest of his men. The rest, who were in danger of the same fate, escaped when Gratus came with the men of Sebaste to help them. After these brothers had treated both their own countrymen and foreigners in this way throughout the whole war, 3 of them were eventually subdued, the eldest by Archelaus, and the next 2 when they fell into the hands of Gratus and Ptolemaeus. 4th surrendered himself to Archelaus after Archelaus gave him his right hand as a pledge of safety. Descent came later. For the present, they filled all Judea with a war of plunder. When Varus received the letters written by Sabinus and the captains, he could not help fearing for the whole legion he had left in Jerusalem. So he hurried to relieve them. He took with him the other 2 legions and the 4 troops of cavalry that belonged to them, and marched to Ptolemais. He had ordered the auxiliaries sent by kings and city governors to meet him there. As he passed through Burtus, he also received from its people 1,500 armed men. As soon as the other auxiliaries reached Ptolemais, along with Aretas the Arabian, who brought a great army of horse and foot because of his hatred for Herod, Varus immediately sent part of his army into nearby Galilee, with Caius, one of his friends, as their commander. Caius put those who met him to flight, took the city of Sepphoris, burned it, and made slaves of its inhabitants. Varus himself marched with his whole army to Samaria. He did not interfere with the city, because he found that it had made no disturbance during these troubles. Instead he pitched his camp near a village called Aras. It belonged to Ptolemy, and for that reason it was plundered by the Arabians, who were very angry even at Herod's friends. From there Varus marched on to the village of Sampho, another fortified place. They plundered it as they had plundered the other. As they carried off all the money they found that belonged to the public revenues, everything became full of fire and bloodshed, and nothing could withstand the plundering of the Arabians. Emmaus also was burned after its inhabitants fled, and this was done by the command of Varus, in anger over the slaughter of Arius and those with him. From there Varus marched on to Jerusalem. As soon as the Jews merely saw him, their camps broke up. They went away and fled throughout the country. The citizens received Varus and cleared themselves of any part in the revolt. They said they had raised no commotion, but had only been forced to admit the multitude because of the festival, and that they had been besieged together with the Romans rather than helping those who had revolted. Before this Joseph, the first cousin of Archelaus, had met Varus, along with Gratus and Rufus, who led the men of Sebaste and the king's army. The Roman legion also met him, armed in its usual way. Sabinus, however, did not dare come into Varus's sight, but had already left the city and gone to the seaside. Varus sent part of his army into the country against those who had begun the commotion. They caught large numbers of them. Those who appeared to have been least involved in the tumult he put into custody, but those who were most guilty he crucified. They numbered about 2,000. He was also informed that 10,000 men still remained in arms in Idumea. But when he found that the Arabians were not acting like auxiliaries, but were conducting the war according to their own passions and damaging the country in ways he had not intended, because of their hatred for Herod, he sent them away. Then he hurried with his own legions to march against those who had revolted. By the advice of Josephus, however, they surrendered themselves to him before it came to a battle. Varus forgave the multitude their offenses, but sent their captains to Caesar to be examined by him. Caesar forgave the rest, but ordered that certain of the king's relatives should be put to death, since some of those involved were Herod's kinsmen and had engaged in war against a king of their own family. After Varus had settled matters at Jerusalem in this way, and had left the former legion there as a garrison, he returned to Antioch. Another accusation against Archelaus now came to Rome from the Jews, and he had to answer it. It was brought by the ambassadors who, before the revolt, had come with Varus's permission to plead for the liberty of their country. There were 50 ambassadors, and more than 8,000 Jews living at Rome supported them. Caesar assembled a council of the leading Romans in the temple of Apollo in the palace, a temple he himself had built and adorned at enormous expense. The multitude of Jews stood with the ambassadors, while Archelaus stood on the other side with his friends. Archelaus's relatives stood with neither side. Their hatred and envy would not allow them to stand with Archelaus, yet they were afraid to be seen by Caesar standing with his accusers. Archelaus's brother Philip was also present. Varus had sent him ahead out of kindness for 2 reasons. First, so that he might help Archelaus, and second, so that if Caesar divided Herod's possessions among his descendants, Philip might obtain some share of them. When the accusers were given permission to speak, they first went through Herod's violations of their law. They said he had not been a king, but the most barbarous of all tyrants, and that their own sufferings had proved him to be so. A very great number had been killed by him, and those who survived had endured such misery that they called the dead happy. He had not only tortured the bodies of his subjects, but had afflicted entire cities. He had greatly harmed the cities of his own country while decorating the cities that belonged to foreigners. He had shed the blood of Jews in order to show kindness to people beyond their borders. Instead of the happiness and laws they had formerly enjoyed, he had filled the nation with poverty and the greatest injustice. In short, they said, the Jews had suffered more calamities from Herod in a few years than their forefathers had suffered during all the time since they came out of Babylon and returned home in the reign of Xerxes. Yet the nation had been brought so low by being accustomed to hardship that it submitted of its own accord to his successor, though he brought them into bitter slavery. Accordingly, after Herod died, they readily called Archelaus king, even though he was the son of so great a tyrant. They joined with him in mourning Herod's death and in wishing him success in his succession. But this Archelaus, as if he feared he might not be thought Herod's true son, began his reign by murdering 3,000 citizens. It was as though he meant to offer so many bloody sacrifices to God for his government, and to fill the temple with the same number of dead bodies during the festival. The survivors, after so many miseries, had good reason at last to consider the calamities they had endured, and to set themselves like soldiers in war to receive blows on their faces rather than on their backs as before. Therefore they begged the Romans to have compassion on the poor remains of Judea, and not to expose what was left of them to men who would tear them in pieces with barbarity. They asked that their country be joined to Syria and governed by Roman commanders. In that way, they said, it would soon be shown that those now slandered as seditious and lovers of war knew how to endure governors set over them, provided those governors were tolerable. With this request the Jews concluded their accusation. Then Nicolaus rose and refuted the accusations brought against the kings. He himself accused the Jewish nation of being hard to govern and naturally disobedient to kings. He also reproached all the relatives of Archelaus who had abandoned him and gone over to his accusers. After Caesar had heard both sides, he dismissed the assembly for the time. A few days later, he gave 1/2 of Herod's kingdom to Archelaus under the title of ethnarch, and promised that he would later make him king as well if he proved himself worthy of that dignity. The other half Caesar divided into 2 tetrarchies, and gave them to 2 other sons of Herod. One he gave to Philip, and the other to Antipas, who had disputed the kingdom with Archelaus. Antipas received Perea and Galilee, with a revenue of 200 talents. Atania, Trachonitis, Oronitis, and certain parts of Zeno's estate around Jamnia, with a revenue of 100 talents, were made subject to Philip. Idumea, all Judea, and Samaria formed the ethnarchy of Archelaus, though Samaria was relieved of 1/4 of its taxes because it had not revolted with the rest of the nation. Caesar also made the following cities subject to Archelaus: Stratos Tower, Sebast, Joppa, and Jerusalem. But he cut off the Greek cities Gaza, Gadara, and Hippos from the kingdom and added them to Syria. The revenue of the country given to Archelaus was 400 talents. Salome, besides what the king had left her in his testaments, was now made mistress of Jamnia, Ashdod, and Phasaelis. Caesar also gave her the royal palace of Ascalon. By all this she gathered a revenue of 60 talents, but Caesar placed her house under the ethnarchy of Archelaus. As for the rest of Herod's offspring, they received what had been bequeathed to them in his testaments. Besides this, Caesar granted Herod's 2 virgin daughters 500,000 drachmae of silver, and gave them in marriage to the sons of Pharoras. After this family distribution, Caesar divided among them what Herod had bequeathed to him, which amounted to 1,000 talents, keeping for himself only a few inconsiderable presents in honor of the dead king. In the meantime, there was a man who was a Jew by birth, but had been brought up at Sidon with one of the Roman freedmen. Because his face resembled Alexander's, he falsely claimed to be the Alexander who had been killed by Herod. He came to Rome hoping he would not be detected. He had an assistant of his own nation, a man who knew all the affairs of the kingdom and taught him what to say. The story was that those who had been sent to kill him and Aristobulus had taken pity on them, and had secretly carried them away, putting bodies like theirs in their places. This man deceived the Jews at Crete, and got a great deal of money from them so that he could travel in splendor. From there he sailed to Melos, where people were so convinced that he was genuine that he obtained much more money and persuaded those who had entertained him to sail with him to Rome. He landed at Dicearchia, that is, Puteoli, and received very large gifts from the Jews who lived there. He was escorted by his supposed father's friends as if he were a king. The The resemblance of his face gained him so much credit that those who had seen Alexander and known him very well were ready to swear that this was the same person. Accordingly, the whole body of Jews in Rome ran out in crowds to see him, and an innumerable multitude stood in the narrow streets through which he was carried. The people of Milos were so carried away that they carried him in a sedan and maintained a royal attendance for him at their own expense. But Caesar knew the features of Alexander's face perfectly well, because Herod had accused Alexander before him. Even before Caesar saw the man, he detected the deceit in the reports about his appearance. Still, he allowed the favorable rumor about him to carry some weight, and sent Cylidas, who knew Alexander well, with orders to bring the young man to him. When Caesar saw him, he immediately noticed a difference in his face. When he also observed that the man's whole body was more strongly built and more like that of a slave, he understood that the whole matter was a contrivance. Yet the man's impudence in what he said greatly provoked Caesar to anger. When asked about Aristobulus, he said that Aristobulus too had been preserved alive, and had purposely been left in Cyprus for fear of treachery, because if the two brothers were separated, it would be harder for plotters to get them both into their power. Then Caesar took him aside privately, and spoke to him. "I will give you your life if you reveal who persuaded you to invent such stories." The man said he would reveal him, followed Caesar, and pointed out the Jew who had abused the resemblance of his face in order to get money. He said that this man had received more gifts in every city than Alexander ever did while he was alive. Caesar laughed at the scheme, and because of the man's bodily strength, put this false Alexander among his rowers. But he ordered the man who had persuaded him to be put to death. As for the people of Milos, they had already been sufficiently punished for their folly by the expenses they had incurred on his account. Archelaus now took possession of his ethnarchy, and treated not only the Jews but also the Samaritans with barbarity, because of his resentment over their old quarrels with him. Therefore both peoples sent ambassadors against him to Caesar. In the 9th year of his government he was banished to Vienna, a city of Gaul, and his property was put into Caesar's treasury. It is reported that before Caesar summoned him, Archelaus seemed in a dream to see 9 ears of corn, full and large, being devoured by oxen. He sent for diviners, and some of the Chaldeans, and asked what they thought it meant. One gave one interpretation, and another gave another. But Simon, one of the sect of Essens, said that he thought the ears of corn represented years, and the oxen represented a change of affairs, because by plowing they alter the land. Therefore Simon said, Archelaus would reign as many years as there were ears of corn, and after passing through various changes of fortune he would die. 5 days after Archelaus heard this interpretation, he was called to his trial. I also cannot help thinking it worth recording what dream Glaphyra had. She was the daughter of Archelaus, king of Cappadocia, and had first been the wife of Alexander, the brother of the Archelaus about whom we have been speaking. This Alexander was the son of King Herod, who put him to death, as has already been related. After Alexander's death, Glaphyra was married to Juba, king of Libya. After Juba died, she returned home and lived as a widow with her father. Then Archelaus the ethnarch saw her and fell so deeply in love with her that he divorced Mariamne, who was then his wife, and married Glaphyra. When she had come into Judea and had been there only a short time, she thought she saw Alexander standing beside her. He told her that her marriage to the king of Libya might have been enough for her, but she had not been content with him. Instead, she had returned to his family for a third husband, and shameless woman that she was, had chosen his own brother as her husband. He said he would not overlook the injury she had done him, and that he would soon have her again, whether she wished it or not. Glaphyra survived the telling of this dream by hardly 2 days.
And there we will pause, with Varus's war ended, the rebels broken, and the rival claimants Archelaus, Antipas, Philip still waiting on Caesar's word at Rome. Next time, in Part 9, Caesar carves up Herod's kingdom among the sons, Judea is at last made a Roman province, and Josephus pauses the story to describe the 3 great sects of the Jews, and above all the strange and famous brotherhood of the Essenes. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.